Our aerial journey begins at the old whaling harbour of New Bedford, before crossing Buzzards Bay to Martha's Vineyard. Then it's across to Nantucket, another old whaling island, before heading north across Nantucket Sound to Cape Cod and Hyannis Port, home to the Kennedys. To the north is the Cape Cod National Seashore, and at the end of the peninsula is the old harbour of Provincetown. New Bedford, on Massachusetts' south coast, is nicknamed Whaling City, because in the 19th century this was one of the largest whaling centres in the world, and the whale oil brought great wealth to the town. But by the mid-19th century, the oil was replaced with another type of fuel, petroleum, and the whaling industry declined. It was replaced by the cotton industry, and the old mills, which once employed over 30,000 people, still stand, though today they have found other uses. In the 1840s, there would have been around 700 whaling ships on the world's oceans, and 400 of them were in New Bedford harbour. Voyages could sometimes last for years, as captains sailed the seas in search of whales. A good catch often meant great riches, and the crew would get a share. As a result, whaling drew thousands of men to sign up and risk their lives. One feature of the whaling industry was that captains would welcome men of different races, and on equal footing. In fact, in the 1840s, there was a black captain, Absalom Boston. The resulting whale oil gave rise to New Bedford being known as the city that lit the world. In the middle of the town is the Roch Jones Duff House. The Roches were a successful whaling family, and they built this Greek revival house in the 1830s. It was bought in 1851 by another whaler, Edward Coffin Jones. In 1935, it was sold to Mark Duff, a descendant of a New Bedford whaling family, who restored the house and garden. Today, it belongs to a local historic preservation group. Whaling was a tough and dangerous business, and whalers would visit the Seaman's Bethel before going to sea. The chapel was immortalised as the Whaleman's Chapel in Herman Melville's classic book of 1851, Moby Dick. If the 19th century was the great age of sail, then perhaps the 20th century was the great age of flying, from early biplanes to modern jets. And at New Bedford Municipal Airport, the Wings of Freedom tour had arrived for an air show. 3 World War II aircraft are owned and run by the Collins Foundation, which was established in 1979, dedicated to preserve the aircraft and keep them flying as part of living history. The Wings of Freedom tour is designed to honour those who flew in the war and educate a younger generation as well. Visitors can climb aboard, and those lucky enough to have a ticket can go on a 30-minute flight. This is the B-25 Mitchell bomber. And this is a B-17 Flying Fortress, and one of only 14 still flying in America. Behind is the B-24 Liberator, the only restored flying example in the world. All these aircraft now need a small fortune to be kept airworthy, and can cost up to $5,000 per flying hour to operate. And a new engine on a B-24 will cost nearly $80,000. The B-17 Flying Fortress is a heavy bomber made famous for its role in the daylight strategic bombing campaign over Europe in the 1940s. The B stands for Bomber, not Boeing, who developed the aircraft in the 1930s. Nearly 13,000 B-17s were built over a 10-year period. The B-25 Mitchell is a medium bomber and perhaps most famous for the Doolittle raid on Japan after Pearl Harbor in 1942. It came into service in 1941 and nearly 10,000 aircraft were built. The B-24 Liberator is a heavy bomber which saw service in Europe and the Far East. The aircraft was designed to be mass-produced, and at its peak, a new B-24 rolled off the production line every hour, and nearly 19,000 were built. Close to the airfield and across parts of the state are cranberry fields. This dwarf evergreen shrub is found in acidic bogs and harvested in an unusual way. Before harvesting, the cranberry fields are flooded so that the water covers the plants by about 6 inches. The water reel harvester, which has been used for over 50 years, then removes the fruit from the vines, allowing the berries to float to the surface. It is then easy to corral the cranberries into a corner of the field and pump them into containers. Cranberries now have the commercial status of a superfruit due to their nutritional and antioxidant qualities. And about 95% of the crop goes into juice, packaged as dried fruit or, of course, cranberry sauce, such an essential part of the American Thanksgiving meal. At the end of Butler Point is one of the few seaside golf courses in New England, the Kittenset Club. It was founded in 1922 and is one of America's most prestigious member-only golf clubs, and for years it has been consistently ranked by Golf Digest as one of America's 100 greatest golf courses. The name Kittenset comes from a native Indian word meaning near the sea. The best-known hole is the third, which is on an island. It's a 165-yard par 3, and a tee shot has to cross sand and water to reach the green. And if a player misses the island, they will land up taking a shot from the beach, but only if the tide is out. Just off the point is Bird Island Lighthouse, which has a history stretching back to 1819, making it one of the oldest in the country. The original lantern would have been lit with whale oil. In the great age of sail, the bay was full of ships trading with Europe and the Orient, as well as all the whaling ships setting out or returning with their cargo of whale oil to home ports. In the middle of Buzzards Bay are the Elizabeth Islands. The largest is Notion Island, which is privately owned and protected by a family trust. In fact, 7 out of the 9 islands are owned by the same family. Nashawena Island is the second largest and has an official population of just 2 people. And at the end of the chain is Cuttyhunk Island, the site of the first English settlement in New England around 1605. On the south side of Buzzards Bay is the island of Martha's Vineyard and the Aquinnah Cliffs. From these shores, the Wampanoag Indians went hunting for whales centuries before the rise of the great whaling age of the 19th century. The brightly coloured clay cliffs are now protected as they form part of the spirituality and myths of the Wampanoag people, who form the greater part of the local population. Due to the chalk, the sea has a rare aqua colour, especially when the waves pound the cliffs, and sometimes a reddish colour is released as the waves wash over them. Standing on the top is Gay Head Lighthouse, built in the 1850s and replacing an earlier one from the end of the 18th century, which due to erosion was getting too close to the edge of the cliffs. The lighthouse was also lowered in height so that the light, which can be seen from over 20 miles away, could get under the dangerous fog that often rolls into the bay. The main port of entry to Martha's Vineyard is Vineyard Haven, and known as Knob Knocket by the Wampanoag Native Americans. Most of the town was built just over 100 years ago, because in 1883 a terrible fire swept through the old town and destroyed an area of around 50 acres. Thankfully, a few of the old houses survived. Today it is summer tourism which swells the year-round population of nearly 3,000 people, and most of the houses are summer residences, where beachside houses for rent can cost well over $1,500 a week. During the Great Age of Sail in the 19th century, the harbour was one of New England's busiest, as it was in a strategic position for coastal shipping. And in 1845, nearly 14,000 ships passed through the harbour. On the east coast of Martha's Vineyard is Oak Bluffs, which was the first centre for tourism back in the early 19th century, when it was known as Tent City. This was because the Methodist church members would come each summer, pitch their tents and hold open-air meetings. And after a while, cottages replaced tents and Oak Bluffs became a town. During the summer months, a ferry service runs from the mainland at Cape Cod, bringing in holiday visitors, which swell the local population from 15,000 to 150,000 people. Over the years, Martha's Vineyard has been a favourite haunt of the rich and famous, who can afford the millions of dollars needed to buy a beachside house. Edgartown is the largest town on Martha's Vineyard and stands opposite Chappaquiddick Island, which suddenly became internationally known in 1969 when Senator Edward Kennedy was prosecuted for failing to report an accident when he drove off Dyke Bridge, and his passenger, Mary Jo Kopechne, was drowned. The incident caused a national scandal. Alongside Martha's Vineyard is Nantucket, and on the west side are a series of low-lying islands. The first is Muscoget, which is now deserted and very difficult to get to except in special boats, due to shifting sandbars and riptides. The island was designated as a National Natural Landmark by the Park Service in 1980. Muscoget is perhaps most famous as the southernmost breeding place of grey seals, which are also known as the Atlantic grey seal and the horsehead seal. The island is one of the primary seal colonies off the New England coast, and since 1972 they have been protected from hunters by an Act of Congress, and today around 2,000 pups are born each year during the autumn. However, this increase in population has made it a feeding ground for great white sharks who feast on their vulnerable pups. Tuckanuck Island is owned by its summer residents, who live in the 35 houses. The island has no paved roads or public utilities. Water comes from wells, and electricity is run from gas-powered generators, along with solar panels. And most of the transport is provided by golf carts. For those not wanting such a simple life, then on Nantucket all the public utilities are available. The whole island was made an historic district in 1966 to protect the landscape and buildings. The village of Madaket is on the western end of the island, where a large number of summer residences have been built in all shapes and sizes. In the summer, the population of Nantucket swells from 10,000 to over 50,000 people, who come to the island for the good weather, wonderful beaches, glorious sunsets, and peace and quiet. Nantucket is also the name of the main town on the north side of the island. This was once the world's leading whaling port, and in Herman Melville's Moby Dick he refers to the Nantucketers who searched the ocean for whales. For the sea is his. He owns it as emperors own empires. A great fire, fueled by the stocks of whale oil, destroyed much of the town in 1846. The same fate that awaited Vineyard Haven nearly 40 years later. This, together with the decline of whaling and the silting up of the harbour, devastated the town, and it was not until the start of tourism in the mid-20th century that Nantucket's fortunes looked up. Whaling ships have given way to jet catamarans, which ferry passengers to and from the mainland in excess of 40 miles an hour. The jet motors ensures that no animals are struck under the shallow water, as there are no propellers below the surface. There are also regular car ferries as well, and for the wealthier visitor, the local airport can cope with private jets. Needless to say, property on Nantucket, both to buy as well as rent, is very expensive. Some houses can cost over $20 million, and even a small condominium will set you back around $200,000. And a beachside rental can set you back anything up to $20,000 a week. Nantucket is an expensive playground. On the east coast at Sisconset, the cliffs are lined with expensive summer residences. However, the sea is slowly eroding the cliffs away, and it will not be too many years before the front row of houses suddenly land up as beach huts. In 2007, the Sankaty Head Lighthouse, which was built in 1850, was moved about 100 metres inland to avoid it tumbling into the sea. In 1843, an engineer noted that there is a fatal spot upon the coast of Massachusetts where many a brave heart and many a gallant ship lie buried in one common grave. The shoals of Nantucket are known and dreaded by every navigator on the Atlantic, and the light still shines out today. On the northern tip of Nantucket are two finger-like peninsulas which form the Koskate-Kotu Wildlife Refuge. Visitors can see horseshoe crabs, basking seals, shorebirds, deer, and even raptors. And right on the end is Greenpoint Lighthouse, which has been aiding ships for over 3 centuries. On the mainland across Nantucket Sound is Cape Cod and Hyannis. The town is much like others in the area, and in the summer becomes a major holiday centre. But it's also a town which holds a unique place in the hearts of many people around the world, as the home of one of the most popular post-war presidents in America, John F. Kennedy. Along the coast is Hyannis Port, and home to the Kennedy family, and in particular John F. Kennedy, the 35th president. The Kennedy compound is a 6-acre site which is now a National Historic Landmark. The original house was owned by the president's father, Joseph Kennedy, and John, along with his brothers and sisters, spent childhood holidays here. The house was later used as the base for his presidential campaign, and later still as a summer White House. Over the years, other members of the family had houses in the compound. The last resident was Senator Edward Kennedy, and after his death in 2009, the compound can become an education centre and museum. On November the 9th, 1960, President-elect John F. Kennedy gave his victory speech here at the Hyannis Armory of the Massachusetts National Guard. It is now on the National Register of Historic Places. Following the president's tragic assassination in Dallas in 1963, a small memorial park was dedicated to his memory. It's a place where people can quietly sit and listen to the sea. And it was at sea that the president spent many happy days, as his family had a lifelong interest in sailing. The memorial overlooks Lewis Bay, where he was seen as a boy learning to sail, and later taking his own children out to sea. Cape Cod is a thin, U-shaped peninsula and protects Cape Cod Bay, where Europeans first started whaling in the 17th century. On the east side, where the Atlantic Ocean meets the land, is the Cape Cod National Seashore, 40 miles of coast, ponds and pine woods. It became a national park through the support of John F. Kennedy in 1961. And around 4 million people a year come to enjoy the unspoiled beaches. The seashore is one of Massachusetts' true wonders, and the 19th century American poet and naturalist Henry David Thoreau wrote after standing on the beach that a man may stand there and put all America behind him. The Cape Cod National Seashore follows the curve of the peninsula right to its northern end. And at the northern end is Provincetown, which has a history stretching back to the early 17th century and the arrival of the Pilgrim Fathers. With the abundance of fish as well as whales, it is not surprising that the town flourished as a major fishing centre during the 18th century. Following the American Revolution, it grew rapidly and the population was bolstered by a number of Portuguese sailors, who, after working on American ships, came to settle here. By the end of the 19th century, Provincetown was becoming a centre for writers and artists, and as the fishing industry declined, the art community took over many of the buildings. Among the writers who once resided here were Tennessee Williams and Eugene O'Neill, and artists included Jackson Pollock and William de Kooning. In the mid-60s, the character of the place appealed to the hippie movement, as property was cheap and rents low, especially during the winter. In the 1970s, the town became a pioneer in promoting gay tourism, and is now one of the best-known gay summer resorts on the East Coast. Today, Provincetown attracts around 30,000 visitors a year, who come not only for the various festivals, but also the landscape and coast, now part of the National Seashore. It's interesting to think how the Founding Fathers would have reacted to this forward, artistic and free-thinking town. Perhaps their spirits looked down from the most distinctive monument in the town, and in fact the tallest granite structure in the United States. It commemorates the landing of the Pilgrim Fathers in 1620, who spent 5 weeks here exploring Cape Cod before heading inland. It was while the Pilgrim Fathers were here that they drew up the Mayflower Compact, a forerunner of the American Constitution. The monument was built in 1907 and was based on the Italian Renaissance tower in Siena. But it came in for some harsh criticism because of its lack of relevance. One Boston architect commented that if all they want is an architectural curiosity, then why not select the Leaning Tower of Pisa and be done with it? However, an old Provincetown sea captain said that it resembles lighthouses on the coast of Portugal, and Provincetown, you know, is full of Portuguese. Today, it is climbed by thousands of tourists from around the world who get wonderful views over the whole of Cape Cod. What a perfect place to finish this journey. Our aerial journey starts by the Drakensberg Mountains and across some of the bloodiest battlefields of the 19th century, before heading north to the Kruger National Park and on through Blyde Canyon to Polokwane. From there it's south to Pretoria, Johannesburg and Bloemfontein, before heading west to Kimberly and on to the Agrabes Falls. From there it's down the west coast, before finishing the journey in the dramatic Cederberg Mountains. South Africa is a country of contrasting landscapes, and here to the east of the dramatic Drakensberg Mountains, a vast fertile plain stretches out where small farms and private game reserves can be found. But this seemingly peaceful countryside was the site of violent battles during the 19th century. The Second Boer War began in 1899 and was between the British and South African Boers over who ruled their proclaimed republics. Some of the battles were fiercely fought, and the casualties on both sides were high. The Battle of Spion was one of them, and it gets its name from this hill where the action took place. It was a major disaster for the British. Visitors today can walk amongst the moving memorials and graves of soldiers from both sides. The Boers held the hill, and the British, who thought only a handful of Boers were up there, attacked at night, took a sentry post and thought they had taken the main part of the hill, only to find in the clearing morning mist that they had not, and that the main Boer army was waiting. The British were outnumbered and suffered terrible casualties before reinforcements arrived, which enabled the army to retreat off the hill. From a British defeat to an outstanding victory against all odds 20 years earlier. It took place here at Rorke's Drift, where in 1879 139 British soldiers held out against 4,000 Zulu warriors for 12 hours. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded for gallantry, the highest number in any single engagement. The hospital where much of the action took place still exists, along with the stores and a memorial and museum. Close by is a replica of a Zulu kraal in a style which would have been around at the time of Rorke's Drift. The Zulu warriors had arrived at Rorke's Drift from a battle where they had inflicted the biggest defeat a British colonial army has ever had, Isandlwana. Here in the shadow of the mountain, roughly 1,300 British and colonial troops lost their lives out of an army of near 2,000. The Zulu force poured around the mountain and, using mainly spears and shields, outmaneuvered the British with skill and iron discipline. Today, memorials and small white stone cairns marking mass graves scatter the slope in remembrance of this battle. "20 miles north, and 41 years earlier, the situation was reversed at the Battle of Blood River, where in 1838 the Dutch voortrekkers inflicted a crushing defeat on the Zulus. The river quite literally flowed red. The voortrekkers, who numbered 470 men, women and children, drew their wagons into a protective enclosure known as a laager. They faced well over 10,000 Zulu warriors, who attacked at dawn. For 2 hours, they held out against 4 waves of Zulu attacks. Women and children reloaded the muskets. 3,000 Zulus were killed, but incredibly, only 3 trekkers were slightly wounded. These wagons are cast in bronze and were erected as a memorial in 1971. The first monument on the battle site was this granite ox wagon in 1947. And in 1998, on the other side of Blood River, a museum and memorial were built to commemorate the fallen Zulu. The shape of the building represents the horns and chest of the Zulu battle formation. 150 miles to the north is Nelspruit, in the Mpumalanga region. This is the largest town on the southern end of the best-known game reserve in South Africa, the Kruger National Park. Restrictions for flying over the Kruger are strict, and aircraft must be above 2,000 feet to create the least disturbance to wildlife. The park is vast at nearly 8,000 square miles, which is almost the exact size of Israel. Spread around the park are various campsites. This one is the Berg and Dal, and the only one set in a rugged mountain environment. From here it's possible to have conducted walks as well as game drives to see the wildlife. Even from 2,000 feet, it's still possible to spot a small herd of elephants as they go about their daily routine. Throughout South Africa, there are many private game reserves, as well as private farms that keep and breed a number of game animals, including wildebeest. Wildebeest meat is widely eaten, as is the meat from water buffalo. To the west of the Kruger Park is Blyde River Canyon, the world's third largest after the Grand Canyon in the United States and Fish River Canyon in Namibia. It is a dramatic and impressive sight. The canyon is 16 miles long and on average about 2,500 feet deep. One of the best views is of the 3 rondavilles, which overlook the canyon. Rondaville being the name of the roundhouses of the local people. The furthest point north in our travels is Polokwane, a mere 100 miles from the border with Zimbabwe. The name Polokwane means place of safety and is the capital of the Limpopo region. In former times, it was called Petersburg. The town also has a new football stadium, which was built for the 2010 World Cup, and has a seating capacity for 46,000 spectators. Our journey now heads west across the north of the country, and the landscape starts to become dry and almost desert-like. This vast open flat space is known as veld, which is the South African equivalent to outback in Australia, prairie in North America, and pampas in South America. There are only a few villages or towns scattered in this sparse landscape. But nothing prepares you for the surprise you get when suddenly a fantasy city seems to rise up out of the arid landscape. This is Sun City, a luxury resort and casino. It opened in 1979 and has been popular ever since. There are 4 hotels, timeshare apartments, 2 18-hole golf courses, exotic-looking swimming pools, and lots of entertainment, including this wave machine. And guests don't have to go far to see elephants, as they are close by and ready to ride. On the outskirts of Pretoria is Hartbeespoort Dam, with its new estates and golf courses. The fluorescent-coloured lake suffers from phosphate pollution, which encourages a very bright green algae to flourish. Pretoria, which is the executive capital of South Africa, is an elegant city centred around Church Square, which is lined with handsome 19th century buildings. The city has many fine museums and galleries, as well as parks and gardens. And on one side of Burgers Park is Melrose House, built in the 1880s for an industrialist. During the Boer War, it became the residence of the British commander, Lord Kitchener. Overlooking the city from the east are the Union Buildings, the seat of the South African government. They were designed in a grand manner in 1910 to celebrate the new Union of South Africa following the end of the Boer War. And it was on these steps that Nelson Mandela was declared president in 1994, and where all previous presidents had been inaugurated. And from the steps, it's possible to see the Loftus Versfeld Stadium. There's been a stadium here since 1906, making it one of the oldest in the country. It was upgraded for use as a World Cup venue. The local historical name for Johannesburg is Gauteng, meaning place of gold. And surrounding the city, it's easy to see why, with all the spoil from well over 100 years of gold mining. Johannesburg, 30 miles south of Pretoria, is the financial heartland of the country, and sleek modern buildings continue to elevate the skyline. The Carlton Centre was once the tallest building on the African continent, at 730 feet. From the top, it's easy to see the city's two World Cup venues. The first is Ellis Park Stadium, and it was here in 1995 that the South African Springboks won the Rugby World Cup in a thrilling match against New Zealand in extra time. To the south of the city is Soccer City Stadium, built in 1989 and the site of the FIFA 2010 World Cup final. The stadium is on the edge of South Africa's largest township, Soweto. The township's history goes back to the gold mining era of the late 19th century, when Africans seeking work were drawn to the mines and were accommodated in separate areas around the city. This segregation continued and was further enforced during the apartheid regime. The word Soweto has been abbreviated from South-Western Townships, and it encompasses all the suburbs in the area. It's estimated that around 65% of Johannesburg's population live here. One of the landmarks of the area are the two cooling towers from an old power station, one of which has been decorated with the largest mural painting in the country. Soweto came to the world's attention in 1976 when there were mass protests about apartheid restrictions in education. 23 people lost their lives when the police opened fire, and the horror reverberated around the world, leading to economic sanctions against South Africa. Today, Soweto is a very different place, and even has guided tours for visitors. There are still the matchbox houses built in the apartheid era, but new, larger, more prosperous-looking dwellings are being built. But there are still the old shanty towns for the poorest, where there are few services and little sanitation. The judicial capital of South Africa is Bloemfontein, 300 miles to the south. To get there means crossing 300 miles of flat, open landscape where electric storms can build up very quickly. Day almost turns to night as nature shows its awesome power. It's certainly not a place for our small aircraft to get too close to. Bloemfontein was once the capital of the new republic the Afrikaners declared in their conflict with Britain. The city is full of fine 19th century buildings, and as the judicial capital of South Africa, many of them are associated with the law. To the south of the city is the National Women's Memorial, commemorating Boer and black African women and children who died in British concentration camps during the South African War. "80 miles to the west, across open veldt, is a city more than any other in the world associated with diamonds. Kimberly. In 1869, diamonds were found in the mud wall of a small house on the eastern edge of the Western Cape. This discovery led to a diamond rush and the birth of Kimberly. Prospectors came in their thousands, and the holes they dug got deeper and deeper until vast chasms opened up around the town. The best known is simply called Big Hole. Here, the first 780 feet was dug by hand, and today the depth stands at 2,500 feet, with another 1,000 feet hidden from view. By 1914, some 23 million tons of rock had been excavated, which yielded over 14 million carats worth of diamonds. And a flawless carat today will set you back around £15,000. So a lot of money was dug out of this big hole in just 50 years. Flying west from Kimberly, and the landscape begins to become drier and more desert-like. Vast estates with miles of fencing carve up the landscape. Long, straight dirt roads are the only means of getting around to check on fences as well as any game. In this type of landscape, ostriches thrive and run free, as do these magnificent sable antelope. Further west, and the landscape begins to turn red, the soil rich in iron ore. And in this hot and arid landscape, a group of Hemsbok search for food. Quite suddenly, out of this parched and unpopulated landscape, a wide strip of green appears on either side of a big river. This is the Orange River, the longest in South Africa at just over 1,300 miles. Surprisingly, the river does not flow through any major city, but it plays an important part in the economy of the country by providing irrigation. And here in the Northern Cape, the banks are lined with vineyards. Downstream and to the west of Uppington is one of the most dramatic sights in the country, and it can be heard before it can be seen. These are the Ograbi's Falls, flowing into the largest granite gorge in the world. The original Khoekhoa people called it Place of Big Noise. Over thousands of years, the Orange River has eroded this smooth-sided gorge, creating a spectacular waterfall of nearly 200 foot. When the river floods, 4 times more water falls here per second than at the Niagara Falls. The surrounding granite landscape seems to come from another planet, with great folds of rock shaped millions of years ago. The area was made into the Ograbi's National Park in 1966. In this arid landscape, an extraordinary tree grows, which is a species of aloe and indigenous to the Northern Cape, the quiver tree. In fact, it's becoming quite a rare sight due to climatic changes. The quiver tree gets its name from the ancient practice of the San people hollowing out the tubular branches to form quivers for their arrows. The landscape may look completely deserted for mile upon mile, but one important aspect of modern life has been built on it: a national highway. The N14 highway runs for hundreds of miles across the Northern Cape, and for much of its length is like a very long ruler laid over the landscape. The highway runs west towards the Atlantic coast, and just inland is an extraordinary area of landscape, and no one is quite sure how it was formed. These circular smooth-topped mounds are known locally as fairy circles, and there are literally thousands of them stretching up into Namibia. Apparently nothing will grow on them, and they have remained a mystery for years. The most plausible explanation seems to be that some sort of termite created them, but it has not been proved. The west coast is a wild, desolate and windy place. The Atlantic rolls in and is much colder than the Indian Ocean on the east coast. The main industry along the coast is mining, and diamonds in particular. Vast mines operate where tons of sand is sifted for diamonds under tight security. Old workings scar the landscape, though today new rules mean that mining companies will have to leave the landscape as they found it. Even the sea yields diamonds, as gravel is sucked up from gullies using a long vacuum cleaner from a specially rigged boat. To the south, houses and small towns start to appear. Lambert's Bay is a popular place to visit, particularly with seafood lovers, as along the coast, open-air fish restaurants offer a fresh catch every day. Inland from Lambert's Bay is Clan William, where a variety of tea can be found, and it's the only place in the world where it will grow. This is the rooibos shrub, which is better known around the world as the plant that produces redbush tea. It has been used by the San people for centuries as a herbal medicine. The plant is narrow and needle-like and picked by hand. It's then cut and dried in the sun on large concrete slabs before being graded and packed. The tea is naturally caffeine-free and very low in tannin. The rooibos shrub is grown in the foothills of the Cederberg Mountains. This mountain range is famous for its rock formations. Over millions of years, wind and water have carved the Cederbergs into a magical landscape. The pinnacles and fissures seem to create fantasy castles, and reddish rocks start to resemble strange frozen creatures. The Maltese cross stands out alone as softer stone has eroded away, leaving this cross-like shape. Up in the high peaks is the Wolfberg Arch, where the softer centre has eroded away, leaving this spectacular formation. And right at the top is Tafelberg Mountain, which in English is, of course, Table Mountain. And it's only 100 miles to the other Table Mountain, and a perfect place to end this journey. Our journey starts in the northeast of New York State at Lake Champlain, before heading west into the Adirondack Park and then turning north to Lake Placid. From there it's west across the state to the St. Lawrence River and the Thousand Islands, before following the shoreline of Lake Ontario to Rochester. We then fly west to the end of the Niagara River before heading upstream to one of the wonders of the natural world, the Niagara Falls. Lake Champlain acts as the border between Vermont and New York and runs for about 110 miles. Towards the southern end is a peninsula on the New York side with an old fort at its end. Crown Point Fort was built by the British and provincial troops in 1758 to secure the region from the French. It's the largest earthen fortress in the United States. On the same site are the remnants of a French fort built 20 years earlier, which was attacked twice by the British before being destroyed by the French as they retreated. But the newer and much larger fort was never directly assaulted by the French and was eventually only manned by a small unit of men. A decade later, it offered no resistance to the Americans at the beginning of the War of Independence. The fort was abandoned in 1780 and is now a National Historic Landmark. Flying west from Lake Champlain, and the vast Adirondack Park opens up. Today, around 6 million acres are protected by a state constitution of 1894, which said that the lands of the state, now owned or hereafter acquired, constituting the forest preserve, as now fixed by law, shall be forever kept as wild forest lands. They shall not be leased, sold, or exchanged, or be taken by any corporation, public or private, nor shall the timber thereon be sold, removed, or destroyed. In the 1950s and 60s, the Adirondack Northway was built, which carves its way through the park and is part of the Interstate 87 route. Contrary to the concept of an interstate, this one doesn't actually leave New York State, making it actually an intrastate freeway, and it is the longest one in the country. The park contains thousands of streams, brooks, and lakes, all surrounded by natural forest. Beaverflow Lake is just one of the thousands that visitors can enjoy in almost complete seclusion. Hunting and fishing are allowed in the park, although in certain areas there are strict regulations. As a result, the lakes are not overfished and are well stocked with trout and black bass. One of the reasons for strict environmental controls in the late 19th century was to manage the lumber industry and iron ore mining. And as late as 1940, a titanium dioxide mine was begun in the Tahawas region. It closed in 1989, and with the march of time, less and less of the mine works are visible, as nature begins to take over. The area does, however, have an interesting claim to fame, as it was here on a hunting trip that Theodore Roosevelt learnt that President McKinley was dying and that he could shortly become the next president. The village of Lake Placid, which sits at the southern end of the lake with the same name, has a place in the history books as one of only 3 places in the world which has held 2 Winter Olympic Games. The first was in 1932 and the second in 1980. Lake Placid was founded back in the early 1800s for mining, but today centres on a range of winter sports. The ski jump seen today have replaced both those built in wood for the 1932 Olympics, and also the jumps erected for the 1980 Games. One reason is that current rules demand heights of 90 and 120 metres. Back in 1980, it was only 70 and 90 metres. Even the old 1980 Olympic flame cauldron still stands where all the athletes gathered for the opening ceremony. The weather in the Adirondack Park can change in a matter of minutes. But even if the landscape is draped in low cloud and mist, its beauty can still be appreciated for its dramatic splendour. This enormous park occupies about a quarter of New York State, and much of it is a wilderness, with only a few intrepid visitors venturing into the remoter parts, where in the distant past Mohawk Indians once hunted. West of the Adirondack Park is the DeGrasse State Forest, one of 40 such state forests, which are heavily protected and together add up to around 19 million acres. The Thousand Islands is the name of an archipelago which straddles the border between the United States and Canada in the St. Lawrence River. The islands run for about 50 miles, and the Canadian islands are in the province of Ontario, with the American islands in the state of New York. There are, in fact, many more islands than 1,000, and actually number close to 1,800, ranging in size from 40 square miles to islands occupied by a single residence, and even smaller uninhabited rocks that are home to migratory waterfowl. The number of islands has been determined using the criteria that any island must be above water level all year round, bigger than 1 square foot, and support at least one living tree. The area is very popular among vacationers, campers and boaters, and is often referred to as the freshwater boating capital of the world. During the late 19th century, several fantasy castles were built on the islands for wealthy industrialists. Singer Castle on Dark Island is one of them. It was originally called the Towers, and the inspiration for its design came from castles mentioned in the novels of the Scottish writer Sir Walter Scott. It was built for the sewing machine magnate Frederick Gilbert Bourne, president of the Singer Manufacturing Company. He died shortly after the castle was completed, and since then it has changed hands several times. The castle comes complete with dungeons, peepholes, and underground passageways. A few miles upriver and past other islands is another fantasy castle, which has a tragic story behind it, and left the castle on Hart Island deserted for 73 years. A hart deer stands proudly on the roof of Bolt Castle, designed to be one of the largest private houses in America. The 6-story castle was going to be an international landmark, and the island was to have other fantasy buildings as well. The castle was named after George Bolt, who owned hotels including the Waldorf Astoria in New York. He employed hundreds of workers to begin the building program in 1900 for him and his family. 4 years later, all work stopped, as tragically his wife suddenly died, and George Bolt simply halted the work, never setting foot on the island again. The house was bought in 1977 by a conservation body for $1, on the understanding it would be restored back to life. To date, some $15 million has been spent. On one end of the island is a small Gothic castle, which was to house the power plant that would supply electricity for the house. And on the other end of the island is Ulster Tower, a rustic-style folly. On an adjacent island is Bolt Yacht House, which could house several tall-masted boats. It also has a distinctive design, complementing the other astonishing buildings on Hart Island itself. A passing storm provides a magical light and also clears the skies over Lake Ontario. This is the smallest of the 5 Great Lakes and the most easterly. The lake is filled by the Niagara River and flows out down the St. Lawrence River. It covers an area of around 7,500 square miles, has a maximum depth of 602 feet and a shoreline of 712 miles. The cool wind that comes off the lake tends to slow down the fruit blossom until the spring frost dangers has passed. This makes it an ideal area for fruit growing, and peaches, apples, cherries, pears and plums are grown along this coastal strip. Just inland from the coast, a certain Colonel Nathaniel Rochester, along with 2 colleagues, bought a 100-acre site in 1803. Rochester was founded. Today the city has the 2nd largest regional economy in the state and has a population of just over 200,000 people, making it the 3rd largest city after New York and Buffalo. Within 40 years of its founding, Rochester was known as Flower City and had become not only the largest flower-producing centre in the United States, but also America's first boomtown. When the flower industry moved west in the mid-19th century, a different type of flower industry took over, and Rochester began to be surrounded by plant nurseries. Rochester is also known as the world's image centre, because it was here in 1892 that George Eastman founded the Kodak Company. An early slogan was, "You press the button, we do the rest." Kodak also pioneered film for the movie industry with 35mm and 16mm formats, which are still being used today. George Eastman built himself a house in the Rochester suburbs in 1902. At the time, his colonial revival-style house was surrounded by 10 acres of working farmland, as well as formal gardens. The house also boasted a built-in vacuum cleaning system, a central clock network, and an internal telephone exchange with 21 extensions. Today, this National Historic Landmark is home to a museum devoted to photography, as well as the conservation of both film and photographs. It also houses one of the oldest film archives in the world. In the mid-19th century, Rochester was at the forefront of the abolitionist movement and even had its own newspaper devoted to the cause. And in this house, Susan B. Anthony, an early civil rights supporter, tirelessly campaigned for abolition, as well as championing women's rights. She was to play a pivotal role during the 19th century to introduce women's suffrage into the country. She died in 1906, 14 years before the 19th Amendment was finally passed in 1920, giving women the right to vote. A few miles up the coast, at the entrance to the Niagara River, is a fort which has seen three nations both attack it as well as defend it: Fort Niagara. It was the French who first built a wooden stockade here in 1678, and then replaced it with a fort in 1726. 30 years later, it fell to the British after a 19-day siege called the Battle of Fort Niagara. During the War of Independence, the fort remained in the hands of the Loyalists, but was ceded to the new American nation after the war. However, in the subsequent War of 1812, the British captured the fort again, only to give it back again after the war ended. It has remained in US hands ever since. Much of what we see today was built in the post-Civil War era of the mid-19th century. The new earth ramparts withstood cannon fire better than masonry walls. It was only in 1963 that the US military finally deactivated the fort, though a military presence in the form of the US Coast Guard still uses part of the site, making Fort Niagara one of the longest continuously run military bases in the United States. After the British withdrew following their defeat in the War of Independence, they did not move very far, in fact, just over the river, where they built Fort George. The fort became the headquarters of the British Army and local militia, and during the War of 1812 was captured by the Americans at the Battle of Fort George. However, it was retaken 8 months later. It has remained in Canadian hands ever since, and only ceased having a military presence in 1965. Both forts are now National Historic Sites. The Niagara River acts as the border between the US and Canada, and 3 bridges handle the enormous number of border crossings each day. The newest is the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge. It was built in 1960, and all the lanes are reversible depending on the flow of traffic between the two countries. Next to the border crossing are 2 enormous hydroelectric power stations. They were built in the late 1950s, and at the time were the largest such facility in the world. The flow of water is regulated during the tourist season by a treaty between the US and Canada, so as not to lessen the dramatic flow over the falls. 10,000 years ago, the falls would have been here, and erosion has steadily moved them back upriver by nearly 7 miles. Erosion has also created the whirlpool, where the river goes through a 90-degree turn. The speed and flow of the water has carved out a bowl 120 feet deep. For a great vantage point of the whirlpool, the cable car offers a pretty good breathtaking view. Amazingly, it was built nearly 200 years ago by Spanish engineers in 1816. There are 2 cities with the name Niagara Falls, and they stand opposite each other overlooking the falls. One in the US and the other in Canada. Both came into prominence at the end of the 19th century due to tourism as well as industry, which used the massive amount of power generated by the river. Visitors in their thousands come to see the falls, and many hotels and restaurants have been built to take advantage of the view. Perhaps the most dramatic is the Skylon Tower. Built in the 1960s, it is 520 feet high and offers dramatic views, particularly of the American Falls. The Niagara Falls are divided into 2 major sections, separated by Goat Island: the Horseshoe Falls, which are mainly in Canada, and the American Falls, with the much smaller Bridal Veil Falls in the United States. The American Falls only receive about 10% of the flow from the Niagara River, with the rest dropping over the Horseshoe Falls. The height of the falls is just under 200 feet, and the length of the relatively straight lip is roughly 900 feet. In 1969, the US Army Corps of Engineers blocked the flow of water for 6 months to see if they could prevent erosion by removing the talus, the sloping mass of rock fragments at the base of the falls. It was decided to leave it alone and let nature take its inevitable course. Visitors can watch the American Falls from the rocky base, or by boat, or perhaps the most dramatic view is from the Prospect Point Park Observation Tower. Even more impressive are the Horseshoe Falls. The facts about the Horseshoe Falls are quite impressive. It's over 2,000 feet wide around the curve. At the centre, the water is 10 feet deep and passes over the crest at 20 miles an hour. The height of the falls is around 180 feet, and the depth of water below the falls is almost the same at near 190 feet. The mist, which resembles smoke, often makes the falls difficult to see. In fact, if it was not for human interference and building underground channels to control the current for the hydroelectric plants, the amount of mist at maximum flow would make it almost impossible to see the falls at all. In 1829, Sam Patch jumped from a tarn to the gorge at the bottom of the falls and survived. He started a long tradition of daredevils going over the falls. A 63-year-old woman called Annie Edson Taylor was the first person to actually go over the falls in a barrel in 1901. She survived. Just. Since then, there have been several attempts, some successful and some fatal. Anyone attempting it today and surviving will be arrested and face stiff fines. In 1960, visitors watched in horror as a 7-year-old boy, Roger Woodward, was swept over the falls with only a life vest. He had been playing upstream with his sister, who was plucked from the river only 20 feet before the falls. He survived, and ever since, his incredible ordeal has been known as the Miracle at Niagara. Well over 20 million people a year come to witness one of the most breathtaking sights in the world, and a perfect place to end this aerial journey.